listeners, let us learn about the critical part written by Northrop Fyre. Herman Northrop Fyre was born in the year 1912 and died in the year 1991. He was a Canadian literary critic and literary theorist. He was considered one of the most influential of the 20th century. Fyre's most important books include Fearful Symmetry in the year 1947. This book was a reinterpretation of the poetry of William Blake. Fyre's reputation was principally on the theory of literary criticism that he developed in his book Anatomy of Criticism in the year 1957. This book was one of the most important works of literary theory published in the 20th century. American literary critic Harold Bloom commented on Fyre's book Anatomy of Criticism as the foremost living student of Western literature. Fyre's contribution to cultural and social criticism spanned for almost years, which earned him recognition and received many honors. Fyre was the first critic to postulate a systematic theory of criticism, that is, to work out, in his own words, he says, a unified commentary on the theory of literary criticism. In his book Stubborn Structure, Fyre is the one to shape the discipline of criticism. He was inspired from William Blake. Fyre developed and articulated his unified theory in his book Anatomy of Criticism, which was 10 years after his first book, Fearful Symmetry. Fyre says that literary criticism is a discipline in its own right, which is independent of literature. He also quotes John Stuart Mill's quote, "The artist is not heard but overheard." Fyre also insists that the axon of criticism must be not that the poet does not know what he is talking about, but that he cannot talk about what he knows. To defend the right of criticism to exist at all, therefore, is to assume that criticism is a structure of thought and knowledge existing in its own right, with some measure of independence from the art it deals with. Quoted from Anatomy of Criticism. In his book Fearful Symmetry, published in the year 1947, Fyre studies about William Blake's visionary symbolism and established the groundwork for his engagement with literary theory. And in his book Anatomy of Criticism in the year 1957, he challenged the hegemony of the new criticism by emphasizing the modes and genres of literary text. Fyre does not analyze the language of individual works of literature as the new critics did, but he stressed the larger or deeper imaginative patterns from which all literary works are constructed. In his later works, he also supplemented the examination of archetype and genre with practical criticism. He then studies T.S. Eliot, epics of John Milton, then Shakespeare's comedy and tragedy, and then English Romanticism. He also studied the mythology and structure of the Bible, which is titled as The Stubborn Structure, Essays on Criticism and Society, which he published in the year 1970. Another book, The Great Code, The Bible and Literature. Fyre's other critical works include The Well-Tempered Critique, 1963, The Secular Scripture, A Study of the Structure of Romance, 1976, Northrop Fyre on Shakespeare, 1986, and Words with Power, being a second study of the Bible and literature, in the year 1990. All these work emphasizes symbols and group myths in literature, and also all these works emphasizes the systematic classification of literary symbols, genres, and criticism. Fyre totally has written 20 books in his lifetime. Most of his works are considered influential. In all his books, he has covered the topic of literary criticism interpreting and analyzing the complex poets as William Blake and T.S. Eliot. Throughout Fyre's lifetime, he was recognized multiple times for his achievements. He has also published long list of publication. He has also featured lectures at over 100 universities worldwide and also awarded 30 honorary awards. Let us see an outline of his book, The Critical Path, an essay on the social context of literary criticism. This book was published in the year 1971, which was published by Indiana University Press. This book takes up a philosophic inquiry into fundamental problems of literature and society. He says that the fundamental problems of literature is an important addition to the canon of America's most original and distinguished critiques. He talks about the function of poetry, of criticism, and provides details in what sense does the poet know, what is the relationship between a society and its art. He also conducts an illuminating survey of these and other broad philosophic issues, which offers many incidental insights into specific cultural phenomena. Along the way, this book talks about Marxist aesthetics, Renaissance humanism, the relation of poetry to religion, the idea of progress, and the challenge of contemporary youth culture. Furthermore, Fyre identifies two predominating ideologies in Western culture, which he designates as the myth of concern and the myth of freedom. Under fully developed myth of concern, he says that myth of concern compromises everything that it most concerns a society to know, and also says that myth of concern's purpose is to hold society together, hence it is deeply conservative. On the other hand, myth of freedom embodies the liberal attributes of objectivity and respect for the individual. Fyre takes these two myths from the Homeric Greece to the present, and he relates these two myths to the types of art and government that they foster, and also talks about the roles of the poet and critique. Then he finally says that these two myths maintains a free and mature society, that we have to become aware of the tension between concern and freedom and the necessity of preserving them both. He then relates to literature that ranges through the entire history of Western philosophy and literature, from Plato to Heidegger, from Sir Philip Sidney to Bob Dylan. He shows that his inquiring mind has once again gone beyond the fields of literature, and it narrowly conceived into the wider region of the history of ideas. He then regards the artist and critique in generous terms, that the artist and a critique are persons who are not insulated from society but involved in it in the most profound sense, and so that they provide a unique study informed by intelligence, broad learning, and grace and precision of style. Let us see a brief note about this book, The Critical Path. Fyre introduces one of his main ideologies as the criticism in literature, and in a text as a whole, he gives more significance to criticism. And according to him, his critical path was majorly on criticism as a theory, and therefore narrates more on the pedagogy of the experience in literary works. In addition to all these, Fyre then relates Immanuel Kant's The Critique of Pure Reason, which is a book by Immanuel Kant. This book seeks to determine the limits and scope of metaphysics. This book is also referred as Kant's first critique. It was published in the year 1781, and referring to this book, Fyre states that dogmatism and skepticism have tenable philosophical position, and that the critical path is alone open. Dogmatism is a tendency to lay down principles as undeniably true without considering of evidence or the opinions of others. Skepticism is a general feeling of doubt about something. It is also a feeling that you are not likely to believe something. It is mostly like a questioning attitude or doubt toward knowledge. Both dogmatism and skepticism is associated with a turning point in Fyre's own development. Fyre narrates his own example of a journey motive when he was 25 years old. He says that he lost his way in the Blake's prophecies. Blake is William Blake. He says that there were many paths that could lead him out that he chose not to, and these paths include the path leading to the social conditions of Blake's time, and the path leading to the history of the time, and the one leading to philosophical factors in Blake's mind. However, Fyre says that the most critical path that he was interested in was the path that led to Blake's symbolic code, and he says through literature he could only achieve this. He further explains on the most vital subjects that the literary critics are more interested in, one of them being the aesthetics subject, as well as giving more emphasis in the archetype. Fyre also deduces that the poet's life is essentially the key to the deeper understanding of the poetry, and says that the poets are assumed to have a sensitive litmus paper response to the social trends. Litmus paper is a test done in labs. This paper test is to determine only whether a solution is acidic or basic. So Fyre says that the poets are assumed to have a sensitive litmus paper response to the social trends, and therefore literature as a whole is taken to be something that the historical processes act on, and literature have not still escaped from a documentary and allegorical procedure. Reading Blake's works, Fyre concludes that there is no private symbolism that he believes. He then says that each poet has a different view and description of imagery. He then refers to Marxist critiques. He says that Marxist is one of the new critics who had condemned the Russian criticism called formalism because they believe that literary form is the basis for the literary significance. Added to this, Fyre took a social view on literature. He there says that it is associated with some limitations, one being that the poetic and metaphorical use of language is not morally used, that is, not used largely, when it comes to the field of literary work. Fyre then gave a definition of new criticism to be, he says, a rhetorical form of critique which deals with rhetoric in the formal sense and established a counterweight to the biographical approach. And this new criticism approach treated poetry as a personal rhetoric. He then says that criticism should build or establish some historical relationship on the past events such that these events can be incorporated into the literary field of literature, and says that this can be incorporated through the short stories in literature. According to Fyre, criticism is the knowledge structure that comes with its uniqueness. Fyre then says that in the modern literature there has been a strong emphasis demanding a response from the reader of the text, which then minimizes everything that is naive and everything with the connected suspense. He concludes saying that intertextuality is used in the critical theory with the modern literature. And Fyre also mentions the fallacy of determinism, which is a phrase that appears to describe the state of affairs which arises when other academic disciplines such as psychoanalysis, anthropology, or sociology are allowed to encroach upon the ground of literary criticism. He says that these critical approaches becomes formulated for solving non-literary problems. Fyre says that he is worried that literary critiques lacks any equal systematic guidelines within their own field, and they tend to borrow these systems from outside literature. He argues that criticism, in order to correct these false or inadequate interpretations, must therefore develop a body of knowledge that connects one literary experience to another. And he discusses the relationship of criticisms to other disciplines. There he quotes, I have always insisted that criticism cannot take presuppositions from elsewhere, which always means wrenching them out of their real context, and must work out its own. He then says that when he begins to write on critical theory, he says all meaning in literature seemed to be referred first of all to the context of intentional meaning. He says the primary meaning of the literary work was assumed to be the kind of meaning that a prose paraphrase could represent, and this final meaning was called the literal meaning, which is a phrase with the luxuriant growth of semantic tangles around it. And he says by placing poetry in its literal or intentional context is to see poetic meaning as related to some verbal area of study outside literature. He says that literature, in short, is different from other kinds of verbal expression, and it is non discursive, non intentional, and non descriptive, and a criticism which does not begin with its assumption. He then says that biography is the essential key to poetic meaning. Finally, Fyre concludes saying, studying literature in the context of other literature means that we will be less likely to capitulate to some extra literary schematism, even though other disciplines may interpenetrate the literary context. Hope this video helps. If you have query, please write it down on the comment box below. And if you have any suggestion for videos, please feel free to write. Thank you for listening.